I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and today we are speaking with Aly Raisman about her documentary Darkness to Light on Lifetime as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel. The first question I wanted to ask you is, did you have, you talk about in this documentary support networks for survivors of this kind of trauma, and I was wondering if what sort of support network were you able to rely on when you were first coming to terms with what had happened to you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. We talk a lot in Darkness to Light about the importance of having a support system and a community, and I recognize that a lot of people don't feel that they have a support system or a community, and it can be really hard to find. I think that I'm still navigating finding my complete support system. I do feel very fortunate that I had people around me that supported me and believed me when I first came forward. I had people in my life that didn't support me, which is so painful. And I think, many survivors can agree that when you are not supported, when you share your experience with someone and your story and you're not believed, it can feel it's so re-traumatizing. And so I can't stress enough how important having that support system is. But even right now in my everyday life, I still have so many ups and downs, and I'm still kind of navigating and coming to terms with everything, and just kind of still trying to have balance. So, sometimes I call my mom or my friends, and I work with a therapist. I think that's really important. So I definitely rely on my support system very heavily, even to this day.
So the other thing I'm curious about is, was it difficult to find survivors who were willing to talk about their experiences on a national stage? And that's my question. Yeah.
It's so interesting. It honestly was not difficult. I think if anything, it was the opposite, where it was actually so difficult for us to navigate who to have on the show, because there's so many survivors out there, and we featured a bunch of survivors on the show, but obviously there are like millions and millions and millions of survivors out there that are struggling and suffering, and so many I think wanted to be on the show because they felt it would be healing. And I found that a lot of survivors, because they didn't really have that support system to be able to be in front of a camera crew and have the opportunity to be listened to and to be able to share their story to the camera. And I also think we're living in a time right now where, of course, there's still mental health and abuse. There's still such a stigma around talking about it, but I do think that there is a space online where a lot of people are really supportive. So I hope that the survivors still feel to this day that it was healing for them. I imagine for myself, even, it's very triggering. So I'm sure for some of the survivors, like, it's kind of feels like can be like an open wound, but everyone, I think, is in a different place in their healing journey. But I think that if anything, I think for us, we wanted to have on like every single person that I've ever met. I have so many people share their stories with me at the airport, the grocery store, events. And so I think a lot of people really want to feel heard and validated. And it just really motivates me to hopefully continue to do more shows or produce more content that shines a light on people that don't normally have the platform that I have, because there's so many people out there that have amazing stories. And I think the show really shows that no matter who you are, I think everyone's story is so important and is going to have such a powerful impact, whether or not they realize it.
What would you say is the big, and I'm sure there are a bunch of them, but what would you say is the biggest misconception that people have about sexual assault?
That's a good question. I'm so curious what other survivors would answer to this question, because I imagine that it totally depends on each survivor's experience. I think that one that just comes to the top of my head right off, right as I'm sitting here, is that I just don't think people understand how common abuse is. I struggle to find women in my life that haven't had a bad experience of some kind of sexual harassment or some type of abuse. And I can't even think right now off the top of my head of someone who hasn't experienced some type of trauma that I know, whether if it's not sexual abuse, there's so many different traumas that people can experience. So I don't think people realize how many people are struggling and battling something. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that I think that whether or not we realize it, we all know somebody, the statistics show that's struggling, and they just might not have, they might not feel safe to do so yet. And I think that's why it's so important to continue to have these conversations. And I also think there's a terrible, there's a this terrible, I'm blanking on the right word. I don't know if the right word is misconception, where, you know, a lot of times when women come forward, they say you're asking for it, or how much do you have to drink, or what were you wearing? And I think that's very damaging and very dangerous, because it prevents people from feeling comfortable to share their story. Survivors often already feel so much shame and guilt. And so it puts the blame on the survivor, and it enables the abuser to keep harming other people. So I think that the more we can talk about stuff, and the more we can destigmatize abuse, it's such a hard thing to talk about, but I think the more we can listen to other people's experiences, the more we can understand, because I don't think we even realize how common it really is.
Yeah, like they're putting, yeah, other people, like whenever people come forward, you have the people putting the onus and the blame on people that are saying, hey, this happened to me.
Yeah, and I actually have found through experiences, sometimes I've actually met people who are, you know, victim shaming or blaming the survivor, and I actually know that person, and I know that person is a survivor too. So sometimes when I speak to survivors, you know, of course it's a horrible feeling to be gaslit and to feel blamed for something that is, it's not, never the survivor's fault. I think also sometimes that when survivors are not ready to come forward with their own experience, or just know how to navigate what they've been through, I've actually seen survivors victim blame other survivors, because I think that it's triggering for them and they don't want it to come up. So I also, for myself, if I see somebody that's shaming me, you know, sometimes I try to realize, okay, maybe this person is, you know, I'm reminding them or I'm triggering them of what happened to them. But sometimes I'm, you know, not in that place mentally, and I'm not able to remember to give people the benefit of the doubt. And then also, you know, I think everyone grows up in different environments, and, you know, maybe someone grew up, maybe they aren't a victim of abuse, but maybe they grew up, you know, and people were always blaming them for everything. And so they just think that everything is their fault. So then they blame other people. So I just try to remember, I think we are all battling so much different mental health stuff. And I do believe that most people are really doing the best that they can at the end of the day. And hopefully, you know, the show that we did is kind of helps to start the conversation. I think that what I saw from some feedback was that a lot of people actually realized that they had been abused, which I take that very seriously. And that's really scary to sit there and watch a show and realize that it actually happened to you as well. So I think the more conversation around healing, the more people can take care of themselves, but also hopefully be more accepting to other people.
You know, you know, what you were saying, you know, reminds me of one of the things that probably shocked me most about this in this documentary was the way in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the way when the Dr. Bartow was his name, when he was first, when the allegations first were made about him, how that community rallied around him. And I felt so bad for, I can't remember the one woman's name who was the color guard, who was on the color guard and, you know, had to wear the ribbon, you know, in support of him. And
Yeah,
I didn't know if she got an apology from the school about that.
do I know?
You know, yeah, I was wondering if you.
You know, I'm not sure, but unfortunately, what happened to Erica and the other survivors, and how the town seemed to rally around an abuser, is far too common. And it's really, it's devastating. You know, as I mentioned, you know, support is so crucial to a survivor's healing, and you know, how a survivor heals can be linked to how their abuse is handled. So it's so important to feel supported and believed. But, you know, what's also horrific is that by them supporting the abuser instead of the survivors, this abuser was unfortunately had access to hurting more children and traumatizing more children. And, the whole family or the whole entire support system around the child is affected. It impacts everyone. When someone is abused, their loved ones are affected because, trauma is very real and very serious. And so, in my experience with my own experience of abuse, I felt that, the organizations that and the adults around us that were supposed to take care of us rallied around our abuser instead of supporting us. And so I've just learned, unfortunately, that oftentimes when an abuser has many victims, there's unfortunately oftentimes it's a lot of adults are enabling that abuse to happen. And that's really devastating to see. And I think another misconception is a lot of times I see online people say, well, why didn't they speak up? And if you really look at, with the experience of my abuse and the survivors that had the same abuser as me, and same with in the show that we discussed in Pennsylvania, there were so many people that spoke up over the years, and people just didn't listen, and they chose to believe the abuser over the survivors. But I also want to say that question of why didn't people speak up, I also think is so unfair, because we have to be more empathetic and realize that, first of all, that question is why so many people don't speak up, because they don't want to feel shamed for speaking up too late or too soon. And there's no such thing. Whenever a survivor feels safe to come forward, that's the right time for them. And I think that's really important. So those questions can be really damaging. And I think that the more we can have these conversations, hopefully the more survivors can feel supported and feel safe to come forward. And hopefully adults will have a better idea of warning signs or red flags to look for if they are concerned that an adult is abusing someone.
Well, Aly, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel later.
Thank you so much.